change into English for this conversation. Thank you, Max, for your intervention. I think there's been a lot of information there. And I want to thank you for everything you presented. Thank you, Alicia and Judith, for being here with us. I already said it, and of course to Max, for sharing this 1 hour and 15 minutes of debate and of discussion among us. And I want to give you, Judith and Alicia, 5 minutes each to make a preliminary and introduction of your views, if you want to react to what Max just presented or you want to add. I'm sure we are going to decline a bit, to put the debate in different perspectives, because I think it's very difficult to say that we don't agree with what Max just said, because it's data-driven, so that's very difficult to oppose to that. But I'm sure there are also different views regarding different regions and regarding different elements when you come down a bit in the analysis. And I'm sure that's going to come up in our discussion. Judith, Alicia, who wants to go first?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, I would like to thank Cesce very much, Fernando, Ricardo, and Beatriz for the very kind invite to such a wonderful event. And also, thank you so much, Max, for dragging our attention to what really matters, and also for highlighting all the progress that has been made. So we had a prep call, of course, before that. So I discussed with Max. I also had a look at all the work that you've been doing, and it made me think, right? So I mostly focus my expertise on EU-related matters. So I said, let's have a look at what has been happening in the EU and the Euro area for the past few decades. And what we have achieved is simply impressive. So we are now very much used to living in a sphere of peace and stability that was not the case less than 80 years ago. So less than 80 years ago, there was World War II. But even if we think about the late 60s, so now the Czech Republic, for instance, is a very well-established EU member state. Nobody doubts that it's a respected EU member state. But in 1968, we had the Prague Spring. So there was this democratic uprising in Prague that was brought down by Soviet tanks, right? Now we are criticizing also very much the single market. Like with all the, and I have some points to make there, probably in a second round of intervention, but we are also now very much criticizing how the how state aid works, the implications that this could have for the single market. But the customs union only started in 1968, so all the progress that we have made in terms of economic integration in the EU is crazy. We are now very much worried, and I think that this is of course very much justified, about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in 1974, Turkey, which is now seen as a mediator in international relations, invaded Cyprus. And part of the Cypriot territory is still illegally occupied by Turkey. And that happened only in 1974. We are in Spain. Spain was a dictatorship, as you all know, until 1975. But until 1974, Portugal and Greece were also under dictatorships. Now we are very well-established democracies. We are now very used to having a single currency, so we go to Brussels on an almost weekly basis. We don't have to go to a currency exchange. The euro is only 25 years old. Again, a very nice achievement. Of course, this does not mean that we have not made mistakes, but I also think that we have learned from those mistakes. So, for instance, let's think about migration policy. So with Syrian asylum seekers, we did not activate in the EU the temporary protection directive. So we came to a bilateral agreement with Turkey, which of course should have not been the case. I really think that that directive should have been activated, but we already activated it with Ukraine. And this migration pact that the EU has recently agreed upon started being devised with the Syrian asylum crisis. So I think that we really learn from past mistakes. Also, let's think about the sovereign debt crisis. Those were very difficult times in the euro area, especially for some member states like Greece, who went through 3 financial assistance programs. Also, Spain had a financial assistance program, although only addressed to the banking sector. And I really think that the EU has learned the lesson that that's not the way of doing things, like signing memoranda of understanding where external bureaucrats impose a conditionality on a member state. It's not the way forward. And that's why things have changed very much with the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why with the Next Generation EU and the recovery plans, we are now much more based on national ownership mechanisms. So I do really think that, of course, we make mistakes, but we learn. And now, since we are with Cesce, I also want to launch a very positive message about the evolution of the Spanish foreign sector, because at the beginning of the 2010s, I mean, Spain had huge external imbalances. So we had a current account deficit of 10% of GDP. We had a debtor position in the net international investment position of 100% of GDP. And now the situation is completely the opposite. So as the Secretary of State for Trade was saying, we have now stable current account surpluses. Spain is the 4th member state after Germany, the Netherlands, and Ireland that contributes more in absolute terms, in volume terms, to the current account surplus of the euro area. So this is incredible. This is something that we should be proud of, because many times we are always launching negative messages about how bad Spain is doing in economic terms. We are not a competitive economy. Look, what we have achieved when it comes to external imbalances is incredible. And of course, Cesce has a very important role, and it's something that you have to be very proud of.
Thank you for that, Judith. I agree on that. Alicia, what's your first intervention and first statement?
First of all, thanks for the invitation. Apologies for my voice. And thirdly, I'm going to spoil the party. Sorry about that. So that's my role here.
That's very much welcome.
Yes. Possibly for 2 reasons. I guess one is I'm a very impatient person. So I'm sorry, that's 200 years ago. I'm focusing on the 5 last years. The rest, probably I would need to thank some people here, my parents, my grandparents. I'm talking about myself. And that is a different picture, even with your graphs. Yeah, I mean, democracy, take democracy. You could all see it, yeah? The share of democracies in the world is coming down, not up. And I could pinpoint quite a few of your graphs basically stagnating. Yes. So let's focus on the present, because that's what we need to do now. The other reason why I'm spoiling the party, or I mean, beyond being very impatient, is that I'm also living in Asia, and I've lived in Asia for 18 years. And that also changed the picture about how I see Europe versus the rest of the world. So I'm very aware of our, what we should be proud of as Europeans, but I'm also fully convinced we're missing the train. And we need to say this, because if we don't say it, we'll miss it 2 or 3 times. And by the time we see the graphs, we won't even be there, because, this is the world, but we're in Europe here. And we need to me, be very aware of the risks that this model that I cherish, I agree with you fully, the risk that this model is unsustainable. And how many other things may go, actually, as I said, in the wrong direction compared to your graphs. So that's the first thing. Now, before I move into what I think we Europeans should do very briefly, we could spend the day, so I'm not going to do that, but just a little bit of perspective on your question. So the world is awful. Not really. I agree, You could say that the picture is mixed, and there's many other things you could show which are very positive, as you saw. So it's not only the change is positive, the picture is also very divided. In which way? Firstly and foremost, when we say whether it's awful or not, do we care about the absolute or do we care about the relative? Do I care about my neighbor or do I care about myself? We don't really know. I mean, we economists know that it's very hard to measure what makes us happy. Is it us or the rest? So a lot of what I think is happening, which explains these negative views you showed, is that people are looking at the neighbor. And there's increasing income inequality in the world, which to me is very much behind that sense of that negativity, because people see that in a way the benefits are not well distributed within a country, across countries. I think that's a lot of that awfulness. It's more about, okay, yes, sure, this is fine, but what about me? I'm not making that progress. Then the other thing is that, yes, the speed. You talk about the speed. Better. Yes, better. But again, I'm not only impatient, but I'm quite, I wouldn't say rigorous, but I mean, I have constraints in my evaluation. Which are the constraints, positive or negative? What we have to make the world better. We have so much more than in the past. I mean, we should make it 1,000 times better. We have technological progress, which we didn't have before. I mean, basically what I'm trying to say is we're measuring ourselves against the wrong benchmark. We should have already ended poverty with our means, but we haven't. So in a way, again, I don't think we can judge progress just on the basis of progress, but on the basis of the resources available to improve, which are much higher than they've ever been. So we're spoiling. We're spoiling our resources increasingly. And that's a measure, and living in Asia, and especially, analyzing the Chinese economy, is a measure that we forget. It's the measure of basically how much I spoiled to do something. And as we move on, and we didn't even talk about climate change here, I will have so much less to spoil. So the progress we have made might not even be there, because when we had the resources to be faster, we didn't use them. So it's a question of resources versus progress that I think would need to be in the analysis to really answer the question, are we really better? And can we be better? And this I'm going to answer only on Europe and with my Asia hat. I think the one thing for me to really bring to the discussion later is to be better, we need to be confident, really confident about our model. Going back to, whether we change it or not, but not just looking around, look at the US, look at Asia, let's copy industrial policy here. We look so, the lack of confidence really is so obvious in our behavior. And that I think is the recipe for failure. So we really need to, I agree, look at our what we've done well, what we haven't done well, but look at who we want to be as Europeans. And then look at the resources and the progress, all of this together. But we can't forget who we are. And I think increasingly that's very hard to measure in any data point you may ever manage to get. But I think this is very important. Living in Asia, my feeling is, for many years, Asia, I felt, wow, there's no way we can stop this. This is going to be the new world. We'll have to adapt. We'll have to give up many of the things as a European I love to live with. But I'm starting to think that maybe not, because that model is as unsustainable as ours for different reasons. So the question is, can we learn from what we shouldn't be bringing over to our model from that one? Can we learn what within our set of values and beliefs we should keep and we shouldn't keep? I mean, so learn, but also respect what we have that is valuable. And I think this is an exercise that we've not really hardly started, I would argue. We're still just watching around. Look at the US productivity is going up. Look at the AI revolution. Look at China's industrial policy. Look at EVs from China. But we're not looking, as we said, what we're doing well, but we're not, why, and how to amend it. So thanks for all of that progress. The good thing for somebody like me is that I'll sleep better tonight, after this conversation.
Thank you, Alicia. I think there is a lot of information and a lot of discussions that you have already put in the table, and that's great. If you agree, can we just take a small look to what has happened until now, and then we can devote part of the discussion on how can we build the future with the lessons learned in the past. But I give Max the opportunity to react to these comments, and perhaps we can also talk a bit about. You said it in your presentation, I think it's a bit implicit in what you said. Perhaps we have not had as societies the focus where it should be, and why is that happening? I don't know if it's not only responsible the media, as such, media is a reflection of our society, so I suppose there's something also we can talk about there. Max, yes.
No, I share your impatient frustration. For sure, but I think we are coming already from a different perspective. I think what you already share implicitly with this is this belief we can actually make it better. We have to get there fast. We can actually do something right now. We should have done it 10 years ago. That's a bit the perspective that you bring to the table. But I think, by and large, we live in a society where people are largely believing, even on those things that are moving in the right direction, we are moving in the wrong direction. Yeah. So I think this kind of impatience that you have, and I think that's kind of like an awesome attitude, is just unfortunately as rare as the attitude that I was trying to get across in my talk. I wish the perspective was, hey, we have big problems, it's just frustrating that we don't use the resources better, it's unacceptable that we haven't ended poverty already. But it's just a very, very small share of the population that shares this kind of perspective in the first place. And I think that's what I would like to try to change with this kind of new form of media that I'm trying to build with my team, with our World in Data. And I mean, I see it from like doing this now 12 years or so, like things that we take for granted because we look at the data all the time, or you get around to see Asia and see how fast the world is changing. That's just very foreign to a lot of people out there. And especially with the young generation, I fear that we kind of lose them before we even start. So they're not sharing this kind of perspective that we have to move faster, we have to do better, we have to use our resources better. They're incredibly frustrated. They fear for their own futures. They don't want to have children. They think the world is declining. They think that they're not aware of the big changes in the past and have a much more negative outlook. And they kind of want to tackle this perspective and then hopefully get more people on your side and be as frustrated about
and Max,
the lack of resources.
Just a question on that. Why is that happening when we have a population best educated than ever, and when the information is flowing in the best and the biggest amount in volumes and in everything? Why are we focusing in different things? That comes from somewhere.
I mean, it's obviously all these big questions, and like it depends, I guess, on the different dimensions. But I think for young people, a big one is environmental change, and in a way, I think it's great that so many young people are so much more concerned about the environment than people were in the 60s or 70s. But I think in the environmental conversation, it's very hard to make the point that we're actually doing some things right. A colleague of mine, one of my closest colleagues, has just tried to do it. She's just written a book on. It's called Not the End of the World, and she's making the case that we can be the first generation that achieves a sustainable world. but it's a very hard place to make this case. I think there's a bit this sense that if we don't constantly speak about the dangers and the problems, then we cannot motivate people to do anything. And the perspective that I try to bring this morning is trying a bit of a different model. I think it has to be this combination of emphasizing both the problems and the change. But in the environmental space especially, it's hard to get this message out. And I mean, you were making the point that we have to talk about now and about the short term, and the 200 years is too long a time frame. I think on the environmental aspects, the last couple of years have just been very exciting. The changes in energy prices from renewable sources is just an absolutely fantastic development, and means that we're really in a very different place now than 10 years ago. And I'm much more optimistic about our chance to tackle climate change, which I think is on many young people's minds particularly. 10 years ago, it required a lot of political buy-in. It required a lot of political change. That's still the case. I think we can still do much better, but a lot of it is also now down to market forces and renewables becoming so cheap, electrical vehicles from Asia becoming affordable and being produced at large scale. I'm much more optimistic about that, and I think that perspective, the positive perspective on this big concern that young people have with the environment, is often lacking.
And do you feel, any of you, that perhaps this very much big focus on sustainability and environmental issues are taking out attention to some other SDGs, and we are concentrating too much in this part of the discussion and not so much in the rest related with poverty and any other issue? You feel that you have a lot of relation also with the European Union and with all these think tanks. You feel that something is happening and maybe the origin of part of this discussion, or not that much?
I do think that the EU is putting a lot of efforts on the climate transition. I mean, and for the good reasons. If you have a look at energy dependencies, for instance, the EU is highly dependent from abroad, and one of the main competitiveness issues of the EU precisely is the high energy cost, which is already having an impact, for instance, on highly industrialized economies like the German one. So I think that there's a positive side to that, but maybe we are going a bit too far, especially if we compare ourselves to what other jurisdictions are doing. So climate change and climate protection is a global responsibility. If only the EU is making all the efforts, it will not simply work, and it will make us less competitive. So we also, I think, need to look through the lenses of competitiveness, and that's an issue that I would like to touch upon later on. I don't know if you want me to touch upon it now, maybe later on, because I really want to go through the main factors that I think have an impact on EU's competitiveness, because we many times talk about competitiveness without really knowing what we are dealing with. So in this regard, for instance, if we have a look at what the US has done with the Inflation Reduction Act, everybody, I mean, was happy, like, oh, it's the first time that the US really gets involved in climate transition. But at the same time, it has a very protectionist angle, like, okay, we want to be engaged with climate protection, but we also want to promote our national industry. That's why we're introducing a number of protectionist clauses that has indeed triggered state aid reaction from the EU side to avoid relocation of companies. So I do really think that we should keep on promoting the green transition, but in a more clever way.
It may happen. Some may argue that the United States approach with the Inflation Act is very efficient from the way how many resources
because of the tax credits, because it's done at federal level.
They are going to make an effort, but with something on the other side, not just going for the goal without measuring the costs.
That's it.
Perhaps maybe more the European option this time. Okay, you want to go any other comment on what has happened until now, and if you agree?
On this question that you had on climate and the environmental sustainability conversation, maybe taking really the center stage, and some of the other aspects, global health and poverty, taking a backseat. I think that's an aspect that's a perspective that I very much share. And I was already saying that I think in the last 10 years there was a lot of positive change that should make us more optimistic about the chance to tackle climate change. And at the same time, I think a lot has gone wrong and looks much worse now for the future of global poverty. That's actually something where basically my perspective swapped places. Like I used to be more upbeat about the decline in poverty and more downbeat on the chance to make progress against climate change, and now it has swapped. And one thing that we see with global poverty is that back in 1990, basically the situation was that the huge majority of very poor people lived in Asian countries that went on to achieve extremely rapid economic growth. And so we had this huge transformation of more than 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. Mm-hmm. Now the situation is very different, where the majority of people that live in extreme poverty today, they live in countries that have not achieved economic growth, often in decades. Countries like the DRC, Madagascar, lots of sub-Saharan African countries haven't broken out of that stagnation. And so I think the outlook for poverty is actually much more concerning to me, where basically on current trends, we are nowhere near to reaching the Sustainable Development Goal number 1. And I would think also not on any of the other sustainable goals, unfortunately. But the number 1 goal is to end poverty by 2030, and we are very far away from that based on current trends because of the stagnation in some of the poorest countries. And of course that has a direct link with climate change, because I think people in the richer world will have chances to adapt, to spend money to protect themselves from the impact of climate change, and it will be the poorest people in the world that will be hit hardest. And so I think that's a very concerning development, that stagnation of the very poorest economies.
That's very interesting. Okay, then, do we agree if we go to forecast? What do we do in the future if we had the chance and the opportunity to put in the focus all these very big goals for us as a society? Which lessons have we learned, and what should we do in the different areas of the world and in different elements to improve the situation and improve the perception of people living in our countries, which is so negative? I don't know if, Alicia, you want to go in? What should we do?
Well, I wanted to
what you said before about the model and bit confidence on our model, which is our model and versus ASEAN.
Yes, but I wanted to add, if you allow me, on this climate change issue, and then
yes, of course.
I think our model basically is that we suppress demand, we have tariffs or basically carbon pricing, and we just want everybody to understand that energy is costly. China's way, which to me is what the US has understood and in a way replicated with a switch, with a twist, which I will explain. But China's model is on the supply side. Here's the stuff you need, take it, substitute it, and forget about the demand. Mm-hmm. Basically, that's what it is. And this has huge consequences for our future. The US is doing exactly the same. No carbon pricing. Look, I mean, we don't want to degrowth. If you Europeans want to degrowth, it's your problem. We don't want to degrowth. Indians laugh at us. I have to say this loud and clear when we tell them, but 2070, can you speed up a bit, because you are. Soon there will be the second largest, very soon larger than the US emitters in the world, India. Can you just speed up? Why would I have to speed up? I mean, when I have the supply, I will do it. When you give me the technological progress, I will do it. I'm not going to kill my economy for the green transition. And I think this is something that, again, goes back to the core values. Yes, the transition is important, but we are this tiny in global emissions. We cannot change it. This is the point. Can we convince everybody to follow carbon pricing and do what we do? No. it's bulletproof, that we can't. So why don't we? So going back to what we can do, we need to know what we can do, what we can't do. The example of literally, focusing so much on things that we can't change gets repeated with the WTO. Another example. Okay, the world is no longer is no longer globalizing. We have protectionism everywhere. We Europeans still stand, in favor of the WTO reform. Which reform? There's no reform anywhere. We are the only ones. So why don't we just keep the WTO for ourselves? Because eventually nobody's going to follow. We need to learn we can no longer lead the world. We need to learn that. First thing we need to learn. Once you learn that, you behave in accordance to that lesson. So that doesn't mean we change our values, but it means we become aware of our situation in the world. So many of the things we're doing is self-inflicted pain for objectives that we cannot achieve. So for me, linking, the first discussion and indeed what the US is doing, what China is doing, they're basically saying it is great to have all of these cheap solar panels and basically have 100% of our transition depend on China. On paper, it's great. But if you look at you just said it, how Asia reduced poverty, it was certainly not sitting there and saying, give me the solar panels. No, I'm going to produce them. And it's not only China, it's anybody wants to replicate that model. Even India wants to replicate that model. We could do it, and we just let it be. We lost our industrial power. We said, on top of everything, let's really create pain. Why use energy? Just don't do it. It's like, so for me the lesson is if everybody wants to have an industrial power, we that had one, why don't we want it? Give me a single reason why we don't want an industrial power. I can't think of any. So, and this is a little bit like going back, checking how did Europe become so successful? Because we were an industrial power, for God's sake. Actually, the US deindustrialized much earlier than we are now doing. Yeah? So I think that kept us going. And now just saying that just import everything that everybody else produced just because it's cheaper is unbelievably wrong. But again, because we've lost sight of what made us be here. We've lost sight of that. So this is, again, for the future, anything we do, we need to really, frankly, accept what made us be what we are. Part of that was, yes, everybody was in a rule-based order, WTO, we followed that. Okay, then not only do we have to focus on what we did that was successful, but under which conditions. If the conditions aren't there, you need to change. You just cannot go, autopilot, repeating what was successful if the conditions aren't there. So 2 things we need to do. What made us be here, as successful as Judith described, with better, of any of your, indicators better than the US, from you said life expectancy in the US compared to the US going down, et cetera, but also which conditions have changed that make a lot of what we did not replicable, and then try to adjust. Adjustment, for God's sake. Adjustment, not just autopilot. So all of these things, I think, we are essential for Europe's future.
You are meaning that we have to assume in the European Union that globalization as such didn't work? That's
no, I'm not even going to judge whether it worked or not, because I'm a pragmatist and I'm impatient. So I don't care. It's no longer there. We are globalizing. Any number shows that. Yeah, in any way, FDI, you look at global value chains, basically the size of global value chains. everything indicates that we're globalizing. Yeah. So can we get it? Can we get it? We go to the Intergovernmental Conference of the WTO, and nobody seems to be there really pushing for reform. So can we get it? That we can't spend 20 years trying to do something nobody wants to do. So this for me is the key. Is like, and I know it's very hard for Europe because our model, we're 27 members, is based on those rules, our internal functioning. So that's why we don't want to hear, because it puts at risk our own internal functioning as a European Union. So it's much worse than for any nation. That's clear. But okay, I get it. It's hard for us. So move even double as fast because it's so hard. Not just so. Yeah, I would argue that yes, we need to reassess where we are in the world. If you go to Asia, some of you may. Just talk about Europe. Have a try. Talk to Indians about Europe. Talk to Chinese about Europe, and then you come and talk to me, and see if we share the same impression. They think Europe is no longer there. I mean, literally, like in terms of relevance. So I'm not saying they're right. Maybe it's because of our own projection of our own power. Fine, but we need to know that. To
put it in the equation. Yeah, I agree on that. Judith, I'm sure you have a lot of things to react
I mean,
to that.
I don't live in Alice in the Wonderland, so I do know that EU has a lot of challenges. And I think, and this is, I would say, the most critical part of it, that we know which our challenges are, and we know what we should do. But I have the feeling that there's not the political will to go down that road. So basically now, competitiveness, internal market, they have become buzzwords. So I would like to flesh them out a bit. What are we talking about? So starting with what Alicia said, trade. So EU has relied on trade since inception. So we have relied on free trade agreements. We have relied on a very well-functioning rule-based order via the World Trade Organization. Unfortunately, that's no longer there, or that's no there to the extent as we've seen in the past decades. So, for instance, I mean, I was very sad to see that free trade agreement negotiations with Australia, which is a very like-minded country to the EU, collapsed. Yeah. Now, everybody's talking very much, and this is a very unpopular opinion, but still I'm going to share it with you. Everybody's obsessed, like, will Trump go to the White House? What will happen? Oh my God. Look, Biden has been in the White House already for almost 4 years, and not so many things changed from the trade perspective. So with Trump, there were no traditional free trade agreements negotiated, and it has kept on like this under Biden. So now our main trade element with the US is the Trade and Technology Council, where we are trying to foster a bit of regulatory convergence. This so-called Brussels effect, that when we passed legislation in the EU, all the rest of the developed and even developing world would copycat it. It's no longer there. So we really need to be realistic about what's happening. And I think that the Commission is already starting to be realistic, because all these trade defense instruments are being brought to the table, like the foreign subsidies regulation, international public procurement regulation. Also, some additional elements are being analyzed when it comes to screening of foreign direct investments and even outbound investments. So I think that we are already with that mindset. But, I mean, before I was talking about current account surplus, which, I mean, I think that the current account surplus in Spain is perfect. But then if I think about what other member states are doing, like Germany, the Netherlands, maybe it's just the opposite. So I do really think that that high current account surplus of the euro area maybe is not optimal, because basically we're exporting savings to the rest of the world instead of investing them in our territory. So in a world where free trade is no longer there, or at least not to the extent that it was in the past, maybe this is something that we should be thinking of. I think that we also have a biased view about how developing countries see us, and this very much links to what you said, but now I'm going to discuss Africa. So we need critical raw materials. So the European Commission has identified 34 critical raw materials, and we don't have them in the EU, basically, so we need to import them. Africa is a very rich continent in this regard, and we have the feeling that Africans don't like Chinese, that basically they will simply prefer us Europeans to be there to trade with us. That's not necessarily the case. So if you have a look at the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, there's a lot of criticism as to what China is doing when they're negotiating some loan terms outside the Paris Club, blah, blah. But they see that the Chinese are building infrastructure in their countries. There is Chinese population somehow integrating with African countries, whereas us Europeans, we just go there, we take their critical raw materials, and the rest of the value chain is treated in countries where we think that legal certainty is higher. So this is something that will simply not work. So we really need to change our mindset and say, look, we really need to bring added value to those countries. Otherwise, we will simply not be able to take those critical raw materials that we need. Also, circularity is very important, but it has its limits. So the EU is a highly circular economy. We need to keep on working on that. That's important for competitiveness, but as I said, it has its limits. Funding. Funding is crucial, both from the private and the public sector. The private sector, and this is something that is common knowledge. So we rely too much in the EU on bank funding sources, and not so much on capital markets. And we don't have Silicon Valley, basically because we don't have a well-functioning venture capital industry in the EU. So what do we need to do that? We have been discussing about the Capital Markets Union since 2015. It's not working. How many legislative files have we approved? More than 10 legislative files, more than a dozen legislative files. And still, it's a very nice buzzword, but it means nothing in practical terms. So we really need to do something about that. When it comes to public funding, look, I'm not saying that fiscal discipline is not important, but we really need to manage our public finances in the most efficient possible way. So if we want to fund EU public goods, we need a EU common fiscal capacity. And Northern European member states know this, but there is no political will to go down that road. So this is when I say that we know what we have to do, but there is no political way to do it. This is a clear example of that. Then another key element for EU competitiveness, research and development. So we were discussing yesterday, Alicia, about patents in the EU. So, I mean, in terms of number of patents, we are not doing that bad in the EU. But the issue is what quality those patents have, and then how those are applied. So we really need to move from lab to fab. This is lacking in the EU. Also, when it comes, I mean, if we have a look at the figures of R&D investment, they're way below in the EU if compared to other countries, especially South Korea, for instance. They're at the top of the class there. Energy, I already discussed, energy costs. So we really need to rely on the green transition, but in a clever way. Digitalization and talent. What can I say about digitalization in the EU? We are missing the train there if you think about quantum, if you think about artificial intelligence, if you think about the cloud. But I think that the solution is not to become protectionist in the wrong sense. So I hear some talks around the EU that we should introduce some sort of buy European clauses, forcing our EU companies to engage only with EU cloud providers, for instance, which technologically are behind US technology cloud providers, for instance. This makes no sense. This will simply hurt our competitiveness even more. So we really need to run an analysis and see where our possible competitive advantages are and push there, but incorporating the latest technological possibilities to our production systems and our productive capacities. And well, basically, these are the main elements that the European Commission has highlighted as being the self-reinforcing elements of EU competitiveness. But of course, we could add some additional ones to the table, like total factor productivity, which Alicia mentioned before, where the EU is not doing good at all. And I would even tend to say the size of companies. Company size is also very important when it comes to innovation, when it comes to exporting. So we should really try to make our companies grow. And I leave it at here for the moment.
Okay, wow. Because you have a very listing of things that should be done in a different way, but we don't. You are saying that we don't have the political willingness to do so.
That's my take.
And I may agree with you. So that means that perhaps the system in the European Union, with the Commission on one side pushing for something and the member states not coping with that, how can we manage to make that something that works in the?
People should say that they want this. Mm-hmm. People should say that they want this. I mean, how many pan-European parties do we have in Europe? Where are they? We only have the opposite. So, you know, we complain about our politicians. Let's change the politicians. Yeah, aren't we still able to do this? You know, it's like, I don't know for how long, but, you know, basically, I mean, again, my impatience. I mean, I've been hearing that we don't have political will. I get it. We don't. But as if we Europeans couldn't do anything about it. But the reality is we're not asking for it. Let's face it. We're not asking for change. Look at the votes. So maybe you can add another page on your...
No.
I agree very...
I live in a country that just very much asked for the opposite. So
exactly. So, you know, it's like, I don't know, maybe we're not convincing. I'm clearly not convincing because people are just thinking the opposite. I mean, if you go, I just had this argument on, you know, a federalist argument in a think tank in Europe. I won't mention which one, but it's quite obvious. Oh my God, it seems you're talking about, you know, something, it's like making a profane comment in a church. You know, it's like, you don't talk about federalism in Europe. I mean, then what do we talk about?
Make your point on federalism.
No,
that's very relevant.
I'm just saying it's very simple because, again, I live in Asia. Europe is small. Let's get this right. We are small. We think we're big, we're small. In population, in GDP increasingly. Yeah? I mean, in maybe not the size of the GDP, but the contribution to global growth, we're tiny. We're tiny. And if we look at every member state, if you're Lithuania, okay, good luck. I mean, how do you deal with this world? So why Lithuanians don't see it? Why Spaniards don't see it? Why do we think we're fine with our size in a world of great power competition? It's impossible. The answer is let's regulate each other. And so what? I mean, it's even more constraints, yeah? Because we don't really have a single market. We don't have, obviously, capital market union. We don't have a single fiscal policy. We don't have a fiscal backbone. We don't have any of that, but we regulate each other. Let's go. And so what do we achieve? Basically, markets that are not open to each other. Where are our pan-European companies? I thought we were heading there. I mean, I remember I used to work for the European Central Bank when it was created. And I still remember what was the expectation. The expectation is, firstly, prices will converge. The level, not inflation, which neither of the two ever happened. The level will converge. Science fiction. How? Nobody knew. Second, we will have pan-European banks. Where are they? Pan-European companies. So all of these, you know, would converge thanks to this, you know, M&A will go to the moon, and nothing of what we thought would happen has happened. There has to be a reason. So, you know, I just think that, there is no time to waste. We all like our languages, our cultures, our nations. But at the end of the day, what I want, I have 4 kids. I want a passport that is powerful. I'm sorry, I don't know what you want, but I want this for my kids. Because basically our survival is all about our economic and potentially political power. That's what it is about, because the world is no longer rules-based order where, the tiny Singapore's can do well. Go to Singapore and see how scared they are, because they know the world is no longer in their favor. Yeah, so getting it basically means we need more size in a world of great power competition. I know this won't help mortality or anything else you said, but because I just hope that hopefully Spain will create first pan-European party, or at least be part of it, with other people in the rest of Europe, go to no longer this one, next European Parliament election. Gosh, 4 more years to go. It's just we don't have time. Nothing of this has come out of any crisis, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the COVID pandemic, whether it's the sovereign European crisis. None of these crises have woken up Europe to the point of saying we can no longer go with this model. So what do we need? What kind of crisis do we need? Perhaps we should do it without waiting for the worst. Yeah, start the sooner the better.
I have the feeling, if I may, that the media are very much to blame for what you're saying, because I do think that politicians know what they have to do, because many times they count on technical expertise. But if you have a look at Spanish newspapers, how many times do you see a piece of news that discusses EU affairs, EU position in the world, how we are being threatened from the outside world? Nobody wants to read those pieces of news. People in Spain, they want to read, with all due respect, clickbait about national issues. So if you go outside now and you ask, when will the European elections take place in Spain? Nobody will know. What's the difference between the European Commission, the Council of the EU, the European Council, and the European Parliament? Nobody will know. So I think it's a lack of culture that is somehow very much related to what is in the media. So if we want people to wake up, if we want people to request from politicians a change, I think that the media have a very important role to play in that regard.
The media, which is a reflection of the society, so perhaps something related with education also, no? Because
it's like a vicious circle, and we need to break it, I think. And I think that in Germany and the Netherlands, I have the feeling that people are much better informed about EU affairs, basically because they are net contributors. So this has an implication in financial terms. But I would tend to say that in Southern European countries, people are not aware of the EU. So people are very much pro-European, and this is seen in yearly statistics, Euro barometer. That's clear that I would say that all in all, people in Spain are very much pro-European, but if you ask them, why are you pro-European? They know that they has brought good things to Spain, like infrastructure, but they do not really know how things are evolving. So if we want society to request a change as to how things are done in the EU, we need better informed people. And of course, that's also part of education. So it's not only the media, it also comes with education at schools and universities.
I very much agree. It's the point that I tried to make in the presentation at the beginning. It comes down to what we pay attention to, and we need to pay attention to also the successes. I was shocked, like 12 years ago, I moved to the UK, and I was shocked just to see how the news reported on the EU. Like, it was really no surprise what then followed, because the media, sure, there's this demand side. I guess that's where you're coming from. There's this, I don't quite know what it comes down to in the UK, but it was like an agenda driven by the media to use the EU as a scapegoat for everything. The elites in the UK are playing along because they are off the hook if the people in Brussels get blamed, and then the development went in the way it did. And like for someone, like for a European to live in the UK, it's just really very clear what we're missing out on now that Brexit happened, and what should have been emphasized in the news reporting beforehand, like all of the advantages that we all have from.
They can rejoin, maybe with not with all the benefits that they used to have, like I want my money back, blah blah. But they can rejoin.
Thanks. I'll pass it on.
I'm not sure that's going to happen. That's a good example, Brexit, no, of all these effects of media and how you manage a campaign with a specific target, no, which is really surprising, no, for
Yeah.
us. I have another question for you, for the three of you. You were talking before, Alicia, about an industrial policy, if I understood it correctly, from the European Union side. Which elements you should argue we need on that industrial policy, just to see if someone hears us in any time? Or...
So basically, my research is only about China's industrial policy and whether there's anything we should learn. So we look at their objectives, their actions, and their results. And I think they are quite good at setting the objectives because they're very rigorous in the analysis of what is needed, their bottlenecks, where the world is heading technologically. So all of that is very well done. I would say that we can do that too, and probably, but the question then is, how do you translate it into actions? I would say that our actions are better, interestingly, because we look into the choices of companies receiving subsidies and other forms of industrial policy in China, and there's a lot of actually, it's not as we think here in Europe that, because BYD is great. No, who was BYD? If you actually go into the details, you see that many of the companies being subsidized are not necessarily the leaders when they get subsidized. And there's a lot of research on this, so it is not as perfect as we think it is. But because China puts so many resources, at the end of the day, even if they get one right out of 10, given their economies of scale, going back to the size of Europe, they can still afford a lot of failures because the economies of scale are huge. And they do, of course, finance that with their own savings. On savings and investment, your point, I think there's two things here. China also exports capital. Yeah? It has a big current account surplus, bigger than us now. But the level of savings is very high, so they can afford a lot of mistakes. I'm not saying we should copy that, but I'm saying that their model is not perfect. And on the actual outcome, on the one hand, yes, they move up the ladder. We're not. We're going down in terms of the value added of our exports. I use input-output data. I think overall, in subsectors, we're still moving up, but in general, which is very worrisome. China is moving up, but the ultimate goal is total factor productivity. Is China increasing productivity out of industrial policy? No. So far, no. So my feeling is that as much as our model is not sustainable, their model might not be so sustainable as people think. And is this a good thing for the world? Maybe not, because your ratios are going to look much worse if China really, gets in trouble. So I'm not saying that's good for the world, but it just says that we need to take good things about others, but we need to watch carefully. We just cannot say, okay, there you go, this is the new fashion, we all go for it. And this is true for democracy, another question, yeah?
Yeah.
It seems like non-democratic countries, autocracies perform better. Well, let's look at them more carefully before we actually draw that conclusion. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Alicia.
I guess, since we're speaking about industrial policy and Europe and pointing out the achievements of Europe, I think there I'm a bit more positive. You said earlier that Europe won't be the continent that solves climate change, and I agree, like the emissions.
I don't mean on technological change. I mean to say that we cannot reduce the emissions for the rest of the world. I only meant that. Yeah.
I think we can a bit, because we can affect prices. Like, I think the subsidies that went to renewable energy, they had a massive overspill effect into other economies, and at some point they were just expensive, and there was someone needed to create demand, essentially create subsidies for these industries. And we know that these industries are following Wright's law, so that the price is a function of cumulative production. And as we increase production, because we created demand. We drove down the price of wind and solar. And so we have this positive effect on the rest of the world because the prices are lower than in a world in which we didn't follow this industrial policy. And so it had this positive externality on Asia, on basically the entire world. I think there were big mistakes made. Like I'm really not a big fan of the German energy politics in so many regards in the last years, from gas to nuclear to coal. But I think the industrial policy to create demand for renewables and drive down their costs so that they become competitive worldwide, I think that was a very positive policy.
Just a clarification. We stopped that during the crisis. This country knows a lot about that. Yours too. And our producers collapsed. Wacker in Germany stopped basically producing polysilicon because there were no companies, and China took over. So, yeah, I mean, it would have been nicer to keep it.
It would have been even nicer, but the price would not be as low as it is now without that policy.
No, because China is the main driving force for lower prices. Yeah,
now,
I mean, yes,
but
so
not in the initial stages.
No, because we could have both competed to lower prices. Now there is a monopoly. China is producing 90% of solar. If they want, those prices will not go down. It's just that they're going down because demand is going down. If you look at the numbers, actually, it is mind-boggling. This will delay transition. But the solar panels are no longer, I mean, if you look at Chinese exports of solar panels are plummeting in value because prices are going down, but also in volume now. So what I'm saying is it would have been great to have more competition, that we wouldn't have killed our industry to lower prices, to let China lower prices. Maybe we can lower together, maybe.
Yes, it could have been even better, like, I agree with you. But I think that was still a big success.
Judith, you wanted to add
yeah, on going back to your question on industrial policies, I think that the first question is what we mean as under industrial policy, because traditionally in the EU, industrial policy was of a horizontal nature, so basically relying on the EU single market. There was not much state intervention. But now, lately, due to geopolitical events, it has become more of a vertical nature. So there's a lot of state intervention. And this is what I was referring to before when I had a bit of a criticism with regards to how the internal market is evolving. Because if we think that, if we have a look at the data, and we saw that under the former temporary framework for state aid, 80% of the state aid came from France and Germany. You already see that it's coming from the largest member states, and well, Germany has a lot of fiscal capacity. France does not, but they don't really care, so they are going to put state aid there, and that's it. Then if you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, before I said that there had been a state aid reaction on the side of the EU to avoid relocation of EU companies to the US, and that happened, for instance, with a project by Northvolt. Basically, they said, if we don't get X amount of state aid, from this case Germany, we're basically doing this in the US because they are providing us with these amounts of state aid. It was more than 900 million euros. Germany just put on the table that amount of money, and they were able to keep that investment by Northvolt in the EU, which is perfectly fine. But if this goes on, this can really hurt the single market, the internal market. So here, again, a call for a common fiscal capacity. So if we do this jointly, then we will be able to develop a more reasonable industrial policy that will not hurt the internal market. Otherwise, we can be lost. And the main problem is that now we have 27 different industrial policies in the EU.
With different fiscal capacities, which
it
doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, that's very interesting. If you agree, can we start to look at some of the questions we do have in the panel? And I would like to go to one that Alicia just touched with. What about democracy? Can we be more optimistic on that, or there is no hope? Just to see if we get a bit of a positive comment. Any of you want to answer? It's not just for Alicia, for any of you. Max?
I don't know. This question has been.
On that, can we jump to the other question?
No. Like, I'm happy to speak a bit about it. Like, I think one thing that's just striking about the history of democracy is that people were always asking this question. Maybe not via the QR code and like on some digital screen, but it's 250 years of skepticism against democracy, and in the end, you saw the data briefly there. It was mostly the dictators in the world that should have been worried about their future, because over the long run, it was mostly the dictatorships. You spoke about it earlier, how recent the history is here or back home or in Portugal or Greece. And so somehow the concern is always about democracy, but we lose out of the picture how often it is the dictators that get into trouble. I'm sure you will bring the Asian perspective and
No, I mean, maybe you should add one more, and I'm going to really talk to you about how many things I would add to your, but one could be, where do people want to live, yeah? Where do people want to study? So that's overwhelming democracies, yeah? Now, however, if you tell them, do you want your country to be a democracy? Many might doubt, because they might feel they're not ready for a democracy. They might feel that, this is very much the Chinese chaos. Chaos is, the result of a change in their political system. So it's more about the inability, in a way, or of running things that maybe, but that says a lot about democracy. It means, that, but of course, the fact that democracies are run in countries that might not be ready is also very unappealing, in a way, for change, because you say, okay, if that's what I'm going to get, I may as well not do it. So I guess it is important to look at what are the preconditions. And also the one thing I'm really surprised about democracy is that nobody knows much about how other democracies work. So I happen to have a working relation with an ex-prime minister in Australia, that Malcolm Turnbull, because of a think tank. And I remember he said, what, I don't understand this European. Voting should be compulsory. In Australia, it's fully compulsory. It's like, and then I didn't know about this. And then you realize how different our actual models are, in terms of how we run our democracies or how we improve our democracies. And it tends to be that the changes within democracies, political reform, is nearly impossible. Mm-hmm. And that's a big problem, because if democracy is so successful, it should be resilient to reforms. It should improve. Frankly speaking, autocracies do change. Look at China. I mean, suddenly you have basically a leader who decided, why change? I am staying. And, he just changed the constitution, no questions asked. But the fact that they can do that while we can't is a big problem, because we cannot improve our model. It's just so difficult. So I would say that if we want democracies to be up there in your graph, we need to create easier ways to improve, learn from others, what's working here, what's not working. I mean, have a real discussion. I know that Biden created this thing, what is it? The Summit of Democracies. You go there, you see what they discuss. There's no such discussion. It's basically propaganda for democracy. I mean, it's friend shoring or friend gathering. But I don't think that's what we need. We need to learn from others. What didn't work here? Why this went wrong? What are the preconditions? What are the changes we need in our constitutions, or if we really think things are not working? Because if not, it will not counter. Will not go counter the possible changes in autocratic regimes, no matter whether they're worse.
And that capacity to change, I think, has a lot to do also with not blaming others for what's happening to us. And I think that in Europe, I think blaming the European Union for things that are very much related to our own developments has been very much used by populism, no? Yeah. And that makes it perhaps
But even, I would tend to say, even by national governments, so if you want to pass a reform, it's so much easier to say, look, this is coming from Brussels, so we are just following this. But to be very honest, In this midterm review of the resilience facility of the Next Generation EU by the European Commission, they come to the conclusion that thanks to this carrot and stick mechanism of having funding on the table to bring forward reforms, compliance with country-specific recommendations had increased very much. Yeah. So we also need to think about even financial incentives to bring reforms forward.
Okay, thank you. Shall I go to another? There is another very relevant question. Well, they are all of them very interesting, but I have to pick only one. Does it mean that in a world where power, competition, and individualism prevails over multilateralism and collaboration, nobody is going to care about global challenges? That's the future we are looking at?
That was basically what we were discussing before when we were talking about climate change. So does it really make sense that the EU keeps on adopting very intrusive measures to tackle climate change if other jurisdictions do not, and at the very end of the day, then climate change is not tackled? So the breaking up of the multilateral global order is, to me, very worrying when it comes to global challenges like climate change. Absolutely. So I'm not going to say, indeed, nobody will care, but it's becoming increasingly difficult in a growingly fragmented world, for sure.
When we look at your data, Max, there are some other goals which are no longer there either, no? Global challenges as poverty,
right.
etc. You have to add something to add to that.
No, I think we discussed this one. Like, I think one question that I'm looking at, I think it has these upvotes even, like on the side. The one that has the most upvotes is the question: are millennials and Gen Z going to have better lives than their parents? Obviously, a big question, but I have like two thoughts on this. And one thing I think that's very positive about the young generation right now is a much bigger focus on mental health. And I think that's that was a problem that wasn't acknowledged until very recently. Now it's very much at the center. I think it gives some people the idea that it's actually getting worse when there's not great data on the history of mental health, but some measures that are related do look very positive. For example, we see across Europe suicide rates of young people coming down very steeply. Like, suicide rates are on average falling across the world. It doesn't get the attention that it deserves because the development is the opposite in the US. And as so often, like especially in like Twitter and media conversations, what happens in the US is kind of like assumed to happen everywhere.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is happening right now with the well-being of young people, where in the US, unfortunately, suicides of young people are increasing. But in the huge majority of countries in Europe, and we were speaking so much about the challenges of Europe, suicides are down over the last generation, and I think it's a very positive development that we should learn from. Mm-hmm. And maybe the second one that I'm optimistic about there is education. Like, even thinking back when I was in school, just how much the access to information has changed. We are trying to do our little part with the data side of things, but of course that's just true across the internet. It's just really exciting. And the future of AI, the next talk, I think I'm very excited about the prospects about what AI can do for young people in providing training, providing education exactly at the level that the student needs. And I think if we do this cleverly, then I'm very positive about the future of education and the future of the young generations there too.
Judith and Alicia, you want to add something to this question? Can we get another one? We do have another one, which is just for you, Max. You have shown several evolution graphs, but what would the graph of the quality of all politicians be like in the last 50 years? That's not. I think it's very much included in our comments, but you just. Yeah. I don't know if that quality of those data is something you can manage.
I wouldn't quite know how to measure that accurately. But there too, I think there's a lot of, we have a lot of rose-tinted glasses when we look at the politicians of the past, and we forget just how chauvinistic the politicians of the recent past were. Just like back home, I mean, now I'm out of the UK. Churchill. Like if you read the kind of stuff that Churchill was saying and the kind of admiration that this man still has, it's just completely unthinkable. So I think we judge politicians these days with much harsher, much higher standards than when we think back to these supposedly fantastic politicians of the past. And I think this kind of, I guess that's a bit the challenge. If you wanted to measure this, you would have to find some yardstick that you could keep constant across these 50 years that the person is asking about. And I think we would be surprised to see just how awful in many dimensions major politicians were thinking about big problems in the world. And we would be surprised how biased our perspective there is on the past.
Thank you, Max. And just perhaps the last question, because there is one about media being part of the problem. I think we already discussed that. What can we do to improve that? Max is already doing a lot with his project, and I think that we all should have the responsibility to do so, and that's something very much in our society. And Alicia, a very direct question. Is a war between US and China is possible?
It's possible.
Yes, I suppose.
The answer is yes, it's possible, but how likely it is a very difficult question to answer. I think obviously I don't think either of the two would benefit from a war, which means that that in itself is a constraint. But there's many things that could lead us there. I mean, in a way, we're already in a very different type, but however, still some sort of Cold War already in terms of, if you look at, if you travel to China and you see how different their information ecosystem is, their access to all of the things we take for granted here, including ChatGPT. There's not ChatGPT in Hong Kong. I'm not even talking about the mainland. So you can already see that bifurcation, the technological bifurcation, this kind of two ecosystems growing. It will take time to reduce the cost of a military event by doing that, but that's the direction. The direction is that these ecosystems talk less and less to each other. Just OpenAI, as we all know, is actually not open access. And the main reason to me why OpenAI is not open access is China. If you talk to Kai-Fu Lee, who is basically the best expert in AI that China has ever had in terms of influence, writing books on, by the way, Europe is not there, the AI superpowers, China and the US, everything is like that. Anyway, long story short, he will tell you that's our constraint. The US is containing us, and for how long can China accept that? If they really feel they're falling behind, they may need to provoke. Or if they feel their population is no longer as supportive because the economic situation is not as strong, that's another reason why there could be a war. Now, frankly, living there, especially because I'm mostly based in Taipei, the focus is now the Philippines, it's no longer Taiwan. So, the focus changes, but yeah, proxy wars, could argue that we just avoided one, between Iran and Israel. There's many proxy wars that could start in Asia where you might not have direct confrontation, but you have indirect confrontation. All of that is very possible. Proxy wars are, in my view, quite possible. Yeah.
Okay. If I may, I think that we should avoid that the EU is kept in the middle of these tensions between the US and China, and we are not doing a great job in this regard. For instance, if I think about the Dutch company ASML, the one that produces EUV machines, that is receiving a lot of pressure from the US government. I mean, the US government is putting pressure on the Dutch government. At the same time, there's somehow pass-through effect to the company to stop exporting certain types of machinery to China, which, of course, the company does not like because it's much less business for them, and also to stop repairing some types of machines. I think that we should totally avoid being in that in-between war between these two superpowers. And of course, the Netherlands cannot do this on their own. right? But if we came all together and if we coordinated our policies at the EU level, so if the EU really became a geopolitical actor, which at this time it is not, we may possibly be in a better position to counter those type of pressures.
Okay. Last one.
I just want to say, for the avoidance of doubt, if I may, that say we are a political union. What would be your answer to, wouldn't you not impose export controls on lithography to China? I would, 100%. Why? Because basically, if we don't, that's our only, actually this is a study financed by the UK government, not the European Commission, although on the only points of leverage we have on China. This is the only one.
But maybe
this is the only one.
I would make this decision, but not because the US is telling me to do it, but because based on my analysis and my EU interests, I do it.
I was just saying that for the avoidance of doubt, the fact that we don't follow the US does not mean we would not do the same thing, but we would do it because of our own interests. Yeah.
Okay, we have run out of time. You see that we have capacity of be debating about a lot of different things, all related to the subjects. I want to thank you, the three of you, for being here with us. It has been really amazing for me, at least, sharing this discussion with you. We are going to have now a coffee, and we will go to the next panel, which has a very big challenge related to challenges on artificial intelligence. And I hope it will be as interesting as it has been now. And thank you again for being here with us.